Mi Mr. Lonnie? I was in the hallway of Huntsville Hospital, and I just walked by a rather large young man, and then he spoke my name. I turned and hesitantly responded, "Yes." He smiled big and said, "I used to go to vacation Bible school at your church." I had to be reminded of his name because he was 3 times the size he would have been when he was at vacation Bible school. We exchanged some pleasantries, and I caught up with where he was in his life. Turns out his mother was in the hospital, and they're going to make some very difficult decisions in the next few hours about the end of life issues. He asked if I would come into the room and pray with and for his family. I went into a room, not the room where his mother was, but an empty room they had used for the entire family to assemble, and I was unprepared for the crowd of people in the room. He introduced me to the folks and said that I'd been the minister at the church where he used to go to vacation Bible school. We talked about quality of life, and we talked about difficult decisions about end of life, and I prayed with and for the assembled crowd. I left the room and went about doing the things ministers do at the hospital. It strikes me as funny doing this episode that ministers aren't doctors and ministers aren't nurses. Why do we spend so much time visiting the sick? Within a few days, my phone rang, and it was this same young man. "Hey, my mom passed, and my family would like to use your church for the services, and we'd love it if you would preside." I felt compelled to explain to the young man that the church wasn't mine, but I thought that the leaders of our church would accommodate his family. And I got communication with the funeral home, and we set the date and we set the time, and all the things were arranged, or at least I thought they were arranged. I arrived at the appointed day, and as the assembled crowd was passing by the coffin, people paying their respects, a gentleman from the funeral home approached me and he said, "Well, you must be the pastor." This was not the time or the place to get into technicalities about religious titles, but I said I was the minister. And it was probably very obvious that I was a minister. Number one, I was the only Caucasian guy there, and I was the only guy there with a Bible. And the funeral home guy handed me the obituary, and then handed me a separate sheet of paper and said, "These are the songs the family has requested." I'm not the music minister, I said. I'm just here to do the eulogy. The funeral director said, "You don't understand. When asked to do a funeral, our people handle everything." He walked away. There are a multiplicity of things that I am competent in. I'm not great at anything, but I'm good at a lot of things. Music, singing, song leading, musical theory. That is the singular thing in which I possess zero acumen. I have zero ability. I have zero talent. Jackie and I had met with the committee at Memorial Parkway Church of Christ. They were hiring a youth minister. We were on our way back from Atlanta. We were on a trip in December. I was 21 years old and she was 18, and we'd only been married just a few weeks over a year. And this church in North Alabama was looking for a youth minister. I'd been down to do a speaking trip in Atlanta. We had heard that they were in search of a youth minister. I wanted to stop being the pulpit minister, the guy who's in charge of the church full time and does all the teaching and preaching. And so we had an opportunity to move back into youth ministry. So on our way back from Atlanta to Salem, Arkansas, we stopped and met with these guys. Now, because we were on this 7-8 hour road trip and traveling back to Arkansas, they didn't want to make Jackie just sit in the lobby. They didn't want to make Jackie just sit in our little car. So they let her sit in on the interview. I sat around the table in the conference room, and this group of 7 or 8 assembled men, they asked me about my experience. They asked me about my training. They asked me about my education. They wanted to know my beliefs on various theological topics. And I thought I was doing a pretty good job with the interview and giving some good answers. And then one of the men in the group said, "This all sounds very good. We're very impressed. We were also hoping to hire a youth minister and a song leader." To which Jacqueline just spontaneously slapped the table and said, "Well, we can leave." This is to the amazement and the amusement of the assembled group of men. And that's where she began to explain, hey, Jones can do a lot of things, but singing ain't one of them. I almost told this funeral guy, listen, if you want people to cry at this funeral, then you let me sing. But let me sing they did. Given no other choice, and the fact that this funeral was not attended by members of the Memorial Parkway congregation, I had no choice but to make the best of a very bad situation. I didn't know anybody in this group. I just knew the young man whose family I was helping out. I couldn't walk around and say, hey, there's a guy who leads singing. Hey, there's a guy who. I was the only guy there. I knew. So the visitation concluded and the crowd took their seats and it was time for the service. I stepped to the podium. I greeted the crowd with the typical, we're gathered here today. And then I read the obituary and I said a prayer. And then I announced the family has requested that the first hymn that we sing is Amazing Grace. And I announced a page number in the hymnal. Now you've got to understand where I worship, our fellowship is an a cappella fellowship. We sing and we sing only. We do not use musical accompaniment of any kind at all. There's not a piano in our building. There's not an organ in our building. There's not a stringed instrument in our building. There's nothing in our building but songbooks and voices. So I announced the song. I announced the title. I announced the page number in the hymnal. And I sang the first verse of Amazing Grace. All by myself. And it possessed no grace and it was not amazing. The seagull from The Little Mermaid sings better than I do. You've heard that opera singers can sometimes use their voices to break glass. I can tear a paper cup. I'm standing in this podium and I'm looking at the assembly of several hundred people, and their wide-eyed look of stunned, shocked horror and disbelief is emanating from this crowd. Sweat is rolling down my face. Sweat is rolling down my back. Many of my childhood memories are coming back to me. In the 7th grade, we did a Thanksgiving pageant. Every one of the 7th grade classes sat in the bleachers around the old gymnasium. And then the audience sat in chairs on the gym floor. And then each class had a specific song that they would sing as a class. And then sometimes all the classes would sing together. And they, out of all the students in the 7th grade of Oxford Elementary School, I was the narrator. I was seated on a small stool behind a podium, and I had this large manuscript that I read from. And I thought that I was reading because I had a great voice and I was articulate and could read very well. Standing there in front of this crowd, looking at their horrified faces, it dawned on me, I realized that I had been chosen as the narrator in the 7th grade, not because of my ability to read or to articulate, but because they didn't want me to have any part of any singing whatsoever. I signed up for a song leading class at college. And when I arrived at the very, very first day, the very first class, there was a note on the door, this class has been canceled. Not for the day, for the semester. There wasn't a music professor willing to try to teach me to sing or to lead singing. So I'm standing here in front of this stunned audience after having done a solo of Amazing Grace. And I explained to the audience, look, since we don't have a pianist and we don't have an organist and we don't have a choir, I think that the music would be better if we just all sang together. The number I announced corresponds with the number in the top right corner of the page of the books that are in front of you. And if everybody will turn to that page, then we can all sing together. And I think the service would be better with congregational singing. I heard that, came a voice from this little old lady seated all the way in the back. I don't remember if the audience laughed or not. But the next couple of songs that we tried to sing, they did their best to sing with me. After the service, I walked outside to get in my car and lead the procession to the graveside. The funeral director asked, where is your vehicle? And I pointed to the used Isuzu Amigo. And I pictured this little white and coral pinstriped canvas top pseudo Jeep leading this line of elegant black sedans, to which he responded, oh no. That will never do. We actually have a car for you. And I said, well, do you want me to drive that car? And spontaneously, without thinking, he said, no, if you drives like you sing, no, we have a driver for you and he will bring you back and you tell him when you are ready. It was interesting to me that at the graveside and after the service that the family members who spoke to me and even some of the congregants who were brave enough to approach me, they would tell me after the service, the words you spoke were very comforting. And they made the distinction between the words you spoke and not the words you sang. As a more mature person now, I have the ability to not only admit that I don't possess those talents, I have the ability not only to admit that this is not my gift, I have the ability to say, I can't do that. I'm not the guy who should do that. I should have just stood up and said, hey, the family's asked for these songs to be sung. That's not something I'm good at. Is there anybody here who is A, willing to sing these songs, or B, willing to lead the congregation in these songs? And surely in a crowd of 150 or 200 people, someone would have possessed a talent that I did not possess. At that time, I didn't understand that being in charge or being responsible, I didn't understand that meant I could be responsible for finding someone to do it. In those days, I thought I had to be the guy to do it because I was the guy. That was my worst problem of being a young minister. I thought I had to do it all. As my ministry matured, I learned the value of finding and using resources. I built a very successful youth sponsor committee. We developed a great family ministry or a family-based ministry. In my last 14 years as a youth minister, I had people who could do things I couldn't do. I had people who could do things I didn't want to do. I did the things they couldn't do. I did the things they didn't want to do. And it was a teamwork, and it wasn't dependent on my presence. If you're a minister, if you're a boss, if you're a leader, you've got to build an organization. You've got to build a team that says, if I disappear, this thing will keep going without a glitch. Otherwise, it just becomes a cult of personality. True leadership is not in, hey, look what I did. True leadership is the ability to say, look what we did together. I now have expertise in teamwork. I have expertise in team building. I have expertise in group dynamics. I understand the value of we and not just the value of I. It is very healthy to understand our limits. It's very healthy to understand the things that we can do, and it's very healthy to understand and be comfortable with the things that we can't do. And I think understanding what is not our talent is as much a necessary part of self-awareness and fitting into a group as finding what our talents are and fulfilling that role. And I really do believe that. But having said all that and having made those explanations, I also believe that sometimes we have to step out of our comfort zone. I believe sometimes we have to step up and do the best we can in the circumstances we are in. Because circumstances don't always fit competencies or comfort zones. Crisis don't look at resumes, and a drowning person doesn't care if you have a certificate as a lifeguard or not. You don't have to be a therapist to care, a clergy to minister, or in charge to lead. In the Bible, a childless couple became the father of many nations. A fugitive led a nation out of the very country that he ran from and established a new nation. A shepherd killed a giant. A group of uneducated men who were not rabbis, were told, go and make disciples. A king became a servant. A God became a man. And a blameless holy priest became a sacrifice for sin. Responsibility is not about ability. It's about opportunity. Jackie would ask me, why did you try and do that? Why did you try and do that knowing you don't have the talent? Well, I wasn't the only guy there that could. And I probably wasn't the only guy there that should. But at the time, at the place, and in that moment, I was the only guy they asked.